Joseph W. Stilwell had spent many years in the service of his country and was already an old man when he was called to greatness. His ordeal was both physical and mental, but he carried on where younger and stronger men fell by the wayside. He was a colorful commander, an inspiring leader, and a great military statesman. His basic mission was to keep the Chinese an effective fighting ally in the Second World War. He carried it out with honor and distinction. Joseph W. Stilwell was born in March of 1883 in Florida, but would spend most of his childhood and early youth in Yonkers, New York. His love of sports was evident from an early age. Like any healthy young boy, Stilwell also had a mischievous side and was sometimes a discipline problem. His family felt young Joseph would benefit from a regimented environment, and so in 1900, Joseph Stilwell entered the military academy at West Point. Ironically, the decision would prove to be a fortunate one for our nation. Young men with qualities of courage and leadership would be needed to serve the nation through years of crisis. Hints of these qualities can be detected between the lines of a yellowed class yearbook. As a young quarterback, Stilwell led his teammates to victory, teammates that would, in later years, serve under him on fields far more important than the practice fields at West Point. Graduation from the academy did not end Joseph Stilwell's alliance with the school. As a newly commissioned second lieutenant, he spent the next 11 years teaching foreign language. His natural aptitude for this subject proved to be as fortunate for the nation as his decision to make the military his profession. When he wasn't at the academy, he was assigned to service schools and tours of duties in the Philippines and at home. Meanwhile, history was setting the stage for the first of this century's major crises, worldwide conflagration. In its flames, untried American leadership would be tested and tempered. Joseph Stilwell would be among those to receive his baptism of fire. With the temporary rank of major, Stilwell disembarked in France in 1917 during the bleak, disheartening month of December. He served with the British for a brief period of time and then, because of his fluency in French, became liaison officer for the 17th French Corps. With the war over, it was Colonel Stilwell who went on to serve with the Army of Occupation in Germany, where he remained until July of 1919. Because of his talent with languages, Stilwell's next assignment took him to Peking to study and attain fluency in the intricate world of Chinese dialects. His wife and 3 children joined him in China, and while they were there, 2 more children were born to the Stilwells. Their comfortable home reflected his growing appreciation of Oriental art, and he was considered a connoisseur. To the Chinese people around him, the perceptive Stilwell brought his own humane understanding, cultivating mutual respect and warm regard. One day in the future, these qualities helped forge military victory. In the meantime, he served his country well wherever he was stationed. Joseph Stilwell's next assignment was at Fort Benning's Infantry Training School. Among his classmates, George C. Marshall and Omar Bradley, names that would become household words when the nation went to war. He went on to Fort Leavenworth's Command and General Staff School for several years of study. Then, once again, it was back to China as military attaché to the United States Embassy in Beijing. There he remained, as the conflicting interests of Japan and China led to incident after incident, and then inevitably to all-out war. The armed forces of Japan were well prepared, for the political and military clique which held power had long anticipated this day. The overall plan was to decimate China, destroy her province by province. Meanwhile, the Rising Sun's modern Air Force focused on destroying China's will to resist. The courage of the Chinese in and of itself proved to be an ineffective defense against the finely tuned military efficiency of the enemy. On hand as an observer was Colonel Joseph Stilwell. It became his growing and unshakable conviction that the Chinese soldier was a first-class fighting man with first-class leadership. Chiang Kai-shek, the one leader able to preserve Chinese unity, was now forced to withdraw to the interior city of Chongqing, from where he desperately sought to enlist the aid of other nations. When an American ship was sunk by Japanese bombers while in Chinese waters, American sentiment, long inclined to sympathy for China, crystallized. At first, aid for the Chinese arrived in the form of young Americans acting as private citizens who volunteered their services. One such group, the Flying Tigers, were winning fame as they took a heavy toll on the Japanese Air Force. China's armies began receiving arms and equipment from her allies. Japan, not at all happy that China was receiving supplies, systematically occupied or blockaded one after another of China's port cities. In effect, the Japanese built a wall around China. As the situation in China worsened, Stilwell, now a major general, was back home, serving at California's Presidio in command of the 3rd Army Corps. Step by step, history was setting the stage for a worldwide drama in which Joseph Stilwell would emerge to play an heroic role. Once again, Stilwell was sent to China to serve as Chief of Staff for General Chiang Kai-shek and to take nominal command of China's 5th and 6th Armies. Along with his new position, Stilwell received his 3rd star. China's defenses needed to be built up and maintained until her allies could join her in going over to the offensive. However, her allies were, for the moment, occupied in other theaters of war. General Stilwell's first job was to protect Burma, which offered the only route by which material aid could be fed into China. The Burma that greeted Stilwell had ceased to be a modern Eden of song and romantic fiction. It had instead become a battlefield. General Stilwell and his Chinese soldiers, together with British, French, and Dutch troops, fought bravely, but their effort was doomed. The Japanese steamroller pushed on. They dealt humiliating defeats to the Allies all across the Pacific and in Southeast Asia, and then rolled across Burma. India's borders lay exposed to attack, and the last vital land route to China, the Burma Road, was severed. Once again, courage alone was not enough. For the Allies, withdrawal became retreat. Retreat, a nightmare. During the ordeal, Stilwell's true nature revealed itself. Refusing the comforts his age and rank warranted, he personally escorted a troop of 400 battered Burmese nurses and civilians to the safety of India. There, at New Delhi, he was to utter the now classic admission of defeat and announce his determination to set things right. "I claim we got a hell of a beating," he said. "We got run out of Burma, and it's humiliating as hell. I think we ought to find out what caused it, go back, and retake the place." Here was the honesty, the directness, the tough moral fiber that characterized the man. The battered campaign hat and shirt sleeves now became a familiar sight as the job of regrouping and training began. The job of delivering supplies to the besieged China now fell to the limited number of transport planes that the Allied command could spare. Forced into an around-the-clock schedule, these transports were also bringing in the manpower that would be needed for the return to Burma. In one such operation, 14,000 troops were carried without loss or mishap. Limited in number, too, were the planes needed for training the thousands of Chinese flyers and other units which must continue the aerial war against the enemy. The Flying Tigers became part of regular fighting forces, flying under the leadership of General Claire Chennault. Joseph Stilwell set another goal for his men, this one seemingly impossible: cutting a new road, the Lido Road, through incredibly treacherous land, bypassing the severed link of the Burma Road. Modern machinery and skilled workers were available to clear the road in India. On the Chinese end, it was a far different story. It would take back-breaking manual labor using primitive tools to get the job done. Men, women, and even children threw themselves into the Herculean task. The Chinese people knew what was at stake, and they responded. At an Allied leadership conference in Quebec, greater aid and a newly organized Southeast Asia Command were authorized. The Supreme Commander was to be British Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten, and his deputy, Lieutenant General Joseph Stilwell. Suddenly, the hitherto ignored operations in China captured the imagination of the outside world. The increase in material aid, while welcome, was making greater demands upon air transport. Every type of plane available was used. Many of them lacked modern instruments, making flying in the unpredictable weather precarious. Their route took them over uncharted and treacherous mountain terrain. The stockpile for the coming battle was mounting. The tools were now ready and waiting to help settle an old score. The sideshow war had been remembered. Air power was the prelude to ground attack. Fighters and bombers of the newest types arrived in increasing numbers to sustain the fiery assault. The day had come. Men from China and all parts of the British Commonwealth, from India and Burma and Africa, men of all different races and languages were on the march. General Stilwell's polyglot army also included a growing number of American units. Among them were General Frank Merrill's troops, who were experienced fighters from the Pacific Theater. Merrill's Marauders, as they became known, would help make history. In the 2 years of preparation, General Stilwell had molded a machine to beat the enemy at his own game. Mountain and jungle warfare. While many casualties were inflicted by the modern weapons of war, greater losses occurred from malaria, dysentery, hepatitis, and a wide range of tropical diseases. The enemy and the illnesses were as crippling here as in any other theater. For the men, Burma was no sideshow. Supplies for the men in their isolated pockets of warfare often had to come by airdrop. In twisting, mile-deep canyons and jungle-covered terrain, a drop that missed by a few hundred feet may as well have missed by a few hundred miles. Despite the hardships, Stilwell went everywhere his soldiers did. To the millions who served under him, he was Uncle Joe, the kindest and most modest man who ever lived. The bluntness of his speech also earned him the nickname of Vinegar Joe. Without a doubt, there were saltier names coined in the ranks. Doubtless, too, Joseph Stilwell chuckled over them in private. The term soldier's soldier is certainly overworked, but Joseph Stilwell, who faced the same hardships and dangers as his men, gave the phrase real meaning. He embodied the unique capacity for commanding respect and obedience while evoking a genuine affection. Perhaps no group regarded the general and the man with warmer feelings than did the Chinese troops in his command. It was no secret that General Sir, as he was called, had consistently extolled their courage and promoted their welfare, often in the face of adverse opinion from above. Now they repaid his loyalty with an unbroken string of Chinese victories in the field. Elsewhere in southern Burma, the Salween and Irrawaddy rivers were back in the news. But now these were scenes of success, and it was the enemy who yielded as British-led Allied forces reclaimed more and more of Burma's soil. North and south, it was the same story. An old humiliation was being erased. 2 years after the retreat from Burma, the 61-year-old general could see that his timetable for victory was on schedule. A birthday celebration was a pleasant event and a well-earned respite from the daily grind. The presence of his son, Colonel Joseph Stilwell, Jr., made it a family occasion as well. However welcome or pleasant, such interludes were few and far between. The war in both South and North reached its climax. The enemy knew well that each mile of ground lost in northern Burma meant another mile added between India and China. Under Stilwell's leadership, the Lido Road was growing. On the heels of combat troops came the men who were carving out that road, often under enemy harassment. The land itself resisted their efforts. Jungle growth would completely reclaim and obliterate in 2 weeks' time the work that neither the enemy nor disease nor climate had been able to halt. Against the enemy, there was the rifle always close by. To fight the soil, every weapon from the axe to explosive charge was employed. As General Joseph Stilwell pushed on and the enemy grudgingly yielded, the mule trail became a road. And in relative safety, engineering expanded the road into a solid truck route. As it neared completion, the derisive phrase "impossible road" was heard less often. It stretched across jungle-covered plateaus. It bridged rivers untamed since creation. It traveled across mountain ranges, narrowing the gap between India and China. Then, inevitably, came the great day, the day when the first convoy could travel its 1,044-mile length. The enemy had been pushed out of northeast Burma, and the way lay clear. Considering the difficulties and hardships that had been borne in shaping this seemingly endless serpentine route, there seemed merit in the words of an American colonel who at the outset had said, "You don't have to be crazy to do this job, but it helps." Yet as the first convoy rode into Kumang, a mere token of what was to follow, the Lido Road became a reality. In honor of the man who had weathered military defeat and political opposition, who had overcome impossible odds, it was renamed the Stilwell Road. 4 months later, Allied command announced total victory in Burma. And what of the man who had built the road and forged that victory? The tides and cross currents of events had taken him far from what should have been his hour of triumph. Receiving his 4th star, General Stilwell came home to America. Then it was off to the Pacific for a tour of battlefronts and installations. During the next few months, he became commander of the 10th Army and later served as commanding general on Okinawa. But whatever the assignment, the Stilwell story remained unchanged. He was still blunt, unassuming Uncle Joe, the general with no patience for pomposity and pretense. He was still the gaunt, typical American who somehow resembled the symbolic figure of Uncle Sam. More important, he was still Joseph Stilwell, the general with an understanding of men in the ranks and a talent for winning their affection. As the summer of 1945 came to an end, so did history's most devastating war. On September the 2nd, aboard the battleship Missouri, General Douglas MacArthur submitted the formal surrender terms to a defeated enemy. An end had come to the agonies of a tortured world. Peace had come, in victory, and with honor. Once again, General Stilwell was assigned to the Presidio, but now as a prelude to a well-earned retirement. His loving family and home were in nearby Carmel, where he planned to pass the rich years that lay ahead. But a new enemy struck, an enemy from within who would not be defeated. On October 12, 1946, after a short illness, stout-hearted Joseph Stilwell died. By his own instructions, ceremony was omitted. His ashes were strewn over the Pacific Ocean, whose waters play against the shores of beautiful Carmel. Today, at West Point, the general's old campaign hat and combat boots are treasured mementos. There hangs, too, a portrait to record Joseph W. Stilwell's career of service to his country. To the men there, He stands as an example of, and an inspiration to, greatness. A remarkable man, a remarkable life. Joseph W. Stilwell, a hero. Texas was a prospering state in 1885 when Chester William Nimitz was born in the tiny town of Fredericksburg. The great western plains provided vast opportunities for farming and raising cattle to anyone who was willing to venture into unknown territory. Nimitz was born into just such a pioneering family, one whose faith for their country's future formed the bedrock for their children's heritage. Although his grandfather had once followed the sea, there was little else in young Chester's landlocked childhood to spark his interest in a naval career. As Nimitz was growing, so was America's Navy. While the 100-year-old constellation on which sailors had trained for the Spanish-American War was still in use, America's sea battles were now fought by armored, steam-powered warships. There were many enthusiastic supporters of the new Navy, among them Theodore Roosevelt. America had thousands of miles of coastline in the east and west, and the U.S. Navy, which had destroyed the Spanish fleet in the Philippines, was a vital part of America's future defense and security. The same year Teddy Roosevelt entered the White House, a young Chester Nimitz entered the Naval Academy. The future fleet admiral had never seen an ocean before traveling east. Fortunately, he adapted effortlessly to his new environment. He learned the Navy from the bottom up and grew to love the tough and demanding life he shared with his fellow midshipmen. The physical training was as rigorous as the bookwork. Although American naval tradition extended back to the Revolution, during Nimitz's days at Annapolis, the service was focused on the future. Nimitz graduated 7th in a class of 114. Upon graduation, he was required to serve 2 years at sea before becoming an ensign in the regular Navy. At the time Chester Nimitz joined the fleet, one of America's first submarines was being tested. It was a technological marvel, one with which Nimitz would soon become familiar. After serving several years in the Far East, Nimitz was among a group of worthy young men selected to form what eventually became the Navy's Submarine Corps. In 1912, Lieutenant Nimitz wrote the following passage in his journal. Improvement in the size, motor power, and speed of a submarine craft of the near future will result in a most dangerous offensive weapon. His prediction became a reality during World War I, when the submarine became an integral part of modern warfare. By 1918, Nimitz was one of the most experienced submariners in the service. But a broad and varied background was essential to a man's career in the Navy, and the best place to acquire that background was the service fleet. As a captain, Nimitz commanded major warships in the 20s and 30s, including the cruisers Chicago and Augustus. It was during those years that he had the opportunity to study the kinds of sea and air operations which later proved to be invaluable tools in the war against Japan. As America built up its navy, the Japanese were forging one of the finest fleets that the world had ever seen. On the fateful day of December 7th, 1941 at Pearl Harbor, the United States found out just how formidable the Japanese Navy was. The flames had barely died down before Chester Nimitz was called away from a desk job in Washington to take command of the Pacific Fleet. It was a tough task during a bleak time, and it would take an extraordinary individual to restore hope and deliver victory. Nimitz was to prove equal to the task. The Japanese quickly followed their surprise success at Pearl Harbor with territorial grabs across the Western Pacific, as American forces fought and lost against overwhelming odds. By the spring of 1942, the Japanese dominated both the sea and air west of Pearl Harbor. It was up to America's Navy to hold the line. If America underestimated the Japanese also underestimated America. When Japanese forces disabled the majority of the American fleet at Pearl Harbor, they never thought America would be able to recover so quickly. It was clear that America had to strike back in force. Although Nimitz had a much smaller fleet than the enemy, he never doubted the outcome. The boldness and surprise of Nimitz's strategy changed the course of the war in the Pacific. Attacking the Japanese in the Coral Sea and at Midway, he scored America's first decisive victories. Nimitz expressed the gratitude of the nation when he decorated many of the Navy pilots and sailors who had helped turn back the enemy. As the war in the Pacific changed from one of desperate defense to one of confident offense, the need for careful coordination intensified. The combined naval and armed forces, under the command of both Nimitz and General Douglas MacArthur, battered down the walls of Japan's Pacific Empire. But the war, and the grand strategy that was winning it, was not entirely planned in the conference room. On an inspection tour with Admiral Halsey and Navy Secretary Frank Knox, Nimitz conferred with combat veterans in the Solomons following the bitter 6-month struggle for Guadalcanal. On Kwajalein, Nimitz inspected what was left of Japanese defenses after American forces had hit the island. Wrecked equipment and fire-scorched beaches told the story. Before the Pacific War entered its final phase with the recapture of the Philippines, MacArthur and President Roosevelt met with Nimitz at his headquarters in Hawaii. Just prior to the meeting, word arrived that U.S. forces had captured Saipan, piercing Japan's inner defense perimeter. Although Nimitz and the other American leaders were unaware of it, the Japanese General Staff had already asked its government for a peace settlement with the United States. The Americans did know, however, that Premier Tojo had been forced to resign, and that boosted their confidence. Plans for retaking the Philippines were submitted and approved at the Hawaii meeting. For Nimitz, there was no relaxation of responsibility. As the tempo of the war increased, his life was filled with the critical business of high command. A relentless tide of American sea power swept forward. Behind the decisions which moved the fleet ever closer to Japan was the constant evaluation and the continuous re-examination of his strategy. Under his direction, Halsey, Turner, and others commanded their forces with masterful precision and deadly effect, setting the precedent for subordinate commanders. In New Guinea and the Marianas, the enemy felt America's power. Finally, the day came. October 20th, 1944. American soldiers stormed the beaches of Leyte Island in the Philippines. As the Japanese prepared to defend themselves against the American attack, their adherence to a cause already lost carried them to fanatical excess. Few men on either side realized that the Leyte Gulf action, hoped for by Nimitz and earnestly sought by Halsey, would turn into one of the most far-reaching naval engagements of all time. The lengthy battle for the Philippines cost the Japanese Navy 4 aircraft carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, 9 destroyers, and all hope of ever winning a sea battle against the American fleet. For some of the men, Leyte Gulf was the last fight. Many brave Americans who died during the battle were honored at sea by their comrades. The liberation of the Philippines soon became a certainty, and Nimitz urged his commanders forward. As they closed in on the enemy, Halsey's carriers were both the cavalry and artillery of the Navy. As the power of the Japanese war machine withered and began to die, American ground forces gained control, island by island. But the Japanese were desperate men, and desperation breeds its own terrors. One of its most destructive was the kamikaze, the spirit of the divine wind. American forces referred to them as suicide planes. In the Philippines, they came like fierce hornets. They attacked alone or in groups. For a while, it seemed like the attacks would never stop coming. Just before Easter 1945, Nimitz's ships hit Okinawa. All told, 183,000 troops participated in the landing with the heaviest naval support in the Pacific. Okinawa represented the final, but by no means the easiest obstacle on the road to Japan. As the troops streamed inland from the beaches, the opposition stiffened. It was a last-ditch effort by the Japanese. American casualties were high at Okinawa, but victory was now in sight for the men who had carried their strength and their faith from Pearl Harbor over 3 years ago. Okinawa became the death rattle of the Japanese resistance. With one last compulsive effort, enemy pilots dove their deadly planes at the fleet of American ships who were preparing for the attack. In June, it ended. 4,000 enemy aircraft had found their graves. The only fire in the sky was the setting sun. Nimitz went ashore at Okinawa to view the aftermath. The hope and confidence that were born at Coral Sea and Midway during the dark and doubtful days of 1942 were now fulfilled. These were the men who had suffered the hardships of Guadalcanal and the frustration of New Guinea. Men who had won ringing victories in the Philippines and on the tiny island of Iwo Jima. This was their final triumph. Okinawa, the doorway to Japan. At Manila, Nimitz conferred with MacArthur on their next step, the taking of Japan. The concentrated naval and ground forces of the Allies prepared for the final assault on the Japanese home islands. From long experience, both Nimitz and MacArthur expected that the Japanese would fight until driven into the sea, but it was not to be. With their military and naval might smashed beyond recovery, with their cities bombed to rubble, the enemy surrendered unconditionally. For Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz, it was a solemn moment. A moment of grave reflection. Upon his return, a jubilant nation greeted him. A day was named in his honor, and the whole city of Washington turned out to say thanks. Crowds jammed the streets to get a glimpse of the man who played such a huge role in bringing them victory. At the Capitol building, he went before a special joint session of Congress where he expressed his feelings to the assembled lawmakers.
I am sensible of the fact that I do not come here as an individual, and I acknowledge at the outset that I am here only as a representative of the brave men who fought under my command in the Pacific. Some of them are here with me today. I pray that no future war may ever again find us unprepared. Most of all, I pray that such a war does not begin and end to our disadvantage before we can even begin to fight. This need not happen to us. It will not happen to us if we exercise our intelligence, our vigilance, and use our good, plain common sense and keep our fighting forces ready.
The Admiral's welcome had its lighter side when he smoked the pipe of peace before beginning his new role as America's post-war Chief of Naval Operations. Here Nimitz receives a briefing from Admiral Byrd on the 1946 Navy expedition to the South Pole. One of the many honorary degrees Nimitz received was awarded in a colorful ceremony at Columbia University in 1947. After his tour as Chief of Naval Operations ended in 1948, Nimitz accepted a United Nations appointment as plebiscite administrator for Kashmir. Few of Nimitz's experiences with the United Nations yielded more pleasure than a visit from members of the Japanese Diet. The one-time enemy had become a friend, and the man who had been instrumental in their defeat joined in welcoming them to the community of free nations. In 1951, after Nimitz resigned his United Nations post, President Truman appointed him chairman of a special commission on internal security. Later in life, he continued to be active in naval affairs by serving as a special assistant to the Secretary of the Navy. Nimitz resided in Berkeley Hills outside San Francisco. A weather vane with 5 stars and a submarine were all that marked the Admiral's quarters. Nimitz will forever be bound to the sea and to the great American naval tradition. His contribution in strategy and leadership will long be remembered in the Navy, and his personal example admired by all those who follow the sea. A remarkable life, a remarkable man. Chester W. Nimitz, a hero.
September 11th, 1941. The German killing machine stood on the doorstep of the great Russian city of Leningrad. Once again, blitzkrieg turned architecture into rubble. Soviet Marshal Voroshilov was fast losing ground, and the Russian High Command knew that to keep the weary general in place meant to lose the city. To stem the loss, Stalin sent Army Chief of Staff Marshal Georgy Zhukov to take over command of the defense forces in Leningrad. By reorganizing Russian forces, which included civilian women and children, Zhukov displayed his amazing tactical genius that propelled him through the ranks of the Russian military. His force restructuring culminated in a surprise offensive that eventually reopened rail lines and brought food into the starving city. A short month later, the army commander was called to another front to stem another hemorrhage. It seemed that wherever Mother Russia needed him most, General Georgy Zhukov bravely went. Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov was born in 1896 in the small village of Strelkova, south of Moscow. Like a majority of the peasant population, his family was desperately poor. At the age of 10, young Georgy was sent to Moscow to find work with his uncle as an apprentice furrier and found the working conditions severely harsh. Young Georgy worked 12-hour days. At night, he slept on the cold, hard factory floor. In 1915, the 19-year-old Zhukov was relieved from the drudgery of factory life when he received his military call-up papers and was posted to a cavalry squadron. By 1916, the young soldier's ability was apparent. He was quickly selected for non-commissioned officer training. In his memoirs, Zhukov recorded numerous problems within the Russian Imperial Army. He wrote that the majority of aristocratic generals and officers neglected their troops and had little understanding of the ordinary peasant soldiers. It was a defect that the future general would stamp out within his own command. By March 1917, Bolshevik revolution swept away the old monarchist order in Russia. It was a change Zhukov's poor working-class background supported, and he quickly became a member of the Communist Party. Then, upon contracting typhus, he returned home for convalescence, and it wasn't until late 1918 that he returned to military service. However, every Russian was now called upon to choose sides in what was developing into a civil war. Believing that the communists offered the people the best hope for anything approaching social equality, Zhukov opted to join the Reds. It was during the Civil War that Zhukov showed superiors he was a competent leader, and he rose quickly through the ranks of the newly formed Soviet military forces. In 1923, he became a commander of a horse cavalry regiment. The new commander quickly gained a reputation for detailed planning, unbending discipline, and severity. In 1930, Zhukov became the commander of the 2nd Cavalry Brigade, giving seminars and holding regular war game exercises and large-scale maneuvers. He was also enthusiastic about experimenting with new weapons, including tanks, recently introduced on the battlefields of World War I. It was during the 30s that the Soviet ruler Joseph Stalin began to show his instability. His paranoia exploded in a series of eliminations or imprisonments. The culmination of the purge against the military resulted in the execution of close to 40,000 officers that Stalin felt were not politically acceptable. Even 3 of the top 5 Red Army commanders were executed, leaving the 2 commanders Stalin felt would best toe political lines. In 1938 and 1939, Zhukov again saw action against the Japanese on the Manchurian border, where his tactical genius reigned supreme. By 1940, the gifted tactician was promoted to full general. His ambitious ability impressed Stalin, and in 1941, Zhukov was promoted again to Chief of General Staff. He worked countless hours each day, preparing the Soviet forces for the looming war with Nazi Germany, but was short of defensive resources and experienced officers. No defensive doctrine or counterattack reaction existed because proponents of such plans had been executed for being fatalists. Plus, Stalin wanted no plans that might incite German suspicion about the non-aggression pact between the 2 countries, so as to gain time to plan for the conflict that he was sure would come. June 22nd, 1941, an Operation Barbarossa hit Zhukov hard with the German invasion of the Soviet Union. Zhukov worked tirelessly to plug huge gaps in his front line, while at the same time attempting to bolster waning morale, as hundreds of thousands of Russian servicemen were killed or captured by the German juggernaut. July 29th, 1941, the Soviet High Command held a crucial meeting in Moscow. Their focus was on how to stem this seemingly invincible German advance. General Zhukov urged a withdrawal from Kiev to help stabilize the whole Russian front line. Stalin angrily rejected this suggestion and immediately accepted Zhukov's resignation from his post. In September 1941, Zhukov was reinstated and sent to command the northern front line, with his first major task being the stabilization of Leningrad. Upon his arrival, he immediately replaced the existing commander. He also replaced key staff, thereby restoring confidence. Zhukov also imposed discipline and planned a regimented defense of the starving city. As the general worked to defend Leningrad, the Axis war machine charged for the communist capital. Zhukov was quickly ordered back to Moscow. With the situation deteriorating, the capital city appeared quite ready to collapse. However, winter, thankfully for the Russians, came on with a force, literally freezing Hitler's last advance, as German patrols entered the industrial western suburbs less than 25 miles from Red Square. The weather gave Zhukov room to plan a counteroffensive. Very soon, the Russian general launched a minor attack, forcing the freezing Germans back across the Volga-Moscow Canal. Still commanding from the Kremlin, Stalin called for an overwhelming, massive attack on the nearly defeated German forces. Zhukov begged to delay in an effort to accumulate superior forces as well as sufficient manpower reserves. Stalin overruled and concentrated all his forces on the central front for the big push. In early December of 1941, General Zhukov launched the offensive with 1,500 tanks, 88 infantry divisions, and 15 cavalry divisions on a front 200 miles in length, driving the cold and under-equipped German armies backward with astonishing ferocity. However, despite Zhukov's finest effort, his warning proved to be correct, and the Russian advance stopped cold. Nevertheless, Moscow had been saved, but Zhukov knew this small taste of victory against the Axis was only the beginning of what was sure to be a long and hard-fought war. The German invaders, he knew, were far from defeated. In September of 1942, the German army advanced on the city of Stalingrad. The Russians, already devastated by the power of the German blitzkrieg during Operation Barbarossa, had to make a stand. They could not let the Germans get hold of the oil fields in the Caucasus. Stalin's definitive order was not a step backwards. Zhukov, Stalin's first and only deputy commander-in-chief, was sent to the besieged city to repeat his mission objective from Leningrad just a year earlier. The battle for the city descended into one of the most brutal in World War II. Street by street, Russian soldiers and civilians fought the German invaders in brutal and bloody hand-to-hand combat. Great buildings fell to rubble. Fire and smoke choked the air, and areas captured by the Germans during the day were retaken by the Russians in the darkness of night. The German juggernaut took a great deal of the city, but it was never able to fully close its grasp. To win back complete control of the vast metropolis, Marshal Zhukov used 6 armies, totaling 1 million men, to surround the city. Tank regiments and infantry attacked from the north and the south. The attacking armies met up on November 23rd, with Stalingrad to the east. The bulk of the 6th Army, totaling somewhere between 250,000 and 300,000 men, was now within the environs of the city, while Zhukov moved additional troops around the city. Once again, by stockpiling supplies and launching counterattacks against weakened links in the German front line, Zhukov inexorably tightened the ring around the trapped 6th Army. The Great Red Army now had the Germans trapped in the very city they had tried to take. With 3 army groups under his general command, Zhukov coordinated another inflicting blow to the remaining enemy forces. After sustaining crippling losses, the German 6th Army commander Field Marshal von Paulus surrendered the remnants of his army. Nevertheless, despite their victory, the Soviet casualties were colossal. Close to 1 million were lost to the German siege, with many thousands believed to have been executed by their own command for cowardice in the face of the enemy. It was not uncommon for the hardened Red Army command to force their own men to fight under threat of death from their own guns. To advance was to die, to retreat was to die. Anything to win back the city of their beloved ruler. The losses suffered by the German army in their attempt to take Stalingrad were nothing short of a catastrophe. It was, in the eyes of many, worth the Russian cost. Stalingrad was Zhukov's greatest victory, a tactical masterpiece and the turning point of the war in Europe. An entire German army group was lost in the battle, with 91,000 German soldiers taken prisoner. With such an enormous loss of manpower and equipment, the German military machine could no longer withstand the Russian advance toward Germany when it eventually came. In his anger, Hitler decreed a day of national mourning in Germany, not for the men lost in battle, but for the shame Marshal von Paulus had brought on the army, the government, and the citizens of Germany by losing so much face at Stalingrad. With the victory at Stalingrad under their cap, from now on the Russian soldier would fight harder than he ever had fought before. Yet he would only fight this way for a trusted leader, and under Zhukov's leadership, the Russian soldier fought his hardest. Zhukov was a leader cut from the cloth of a peasant. Some say he was callous and brutal, but his genius, coupled with his willingness to fearlessly face danger, endeared him to his troops and to the Russian people. After Stalingrad, Zhukov was a people's champion. Though Zhukov was now viewed as the people's defender, such regard did not alleviate his responsibility to the war effort. At Kursk in 1943, he masterminded yet another setback to the bleeding German war machine. Here, Zhukov's plan was to make the enemy exhaust itself against Red defenses and then bring up fresh reserves for a general offensive to drive the enemy back. It was another crushing blow for the Russian enemy. From July 1943 on, German soldiers were in retreat on the Eastern Front. Defeat of Germany was now on the minds of everyone. It was around this time in the war that Hitler was heard to say, "The god of war has gone over to the other side." Zhukov was at home in the field as well as in Moscow, planning the overall shape of Russia's offensive campaign. His tactical foresight saw that the massive Soviet Red Army, with a superiority of numbers, reached the Baltic Sea by August 1944, just 2 months after the American and British forces landed on the beaches of Normandy. The Allied noose was now tight around the neck of the Axis. By September, the Soviets had entered Bucharest, liberated the Crimea, and forced their way into Romania, halting on the banks of the Danube River. In late October, East Prussia was invaded, eventually the Russians surging into Poland and stopping, once again, at Warsaw. Despite his genius, Marshal Zhukov was not the only master of the Soviet Red Army. From Moscow, Stalin controlled the Great War by telephone. No Russian commander could rest for any moment, for the paranoid Soviet leader might call by phone and ask unusual questions in detail. Finally, in 1945, the fight for the city of Berlin became Zhukov's final, biggest, and most important battle. The great commander's leadership had taken the Soviet Red Army to the gates of Berlin by early 1945. Upon the Red Army's arrival on the front, Zhukov was called back to Moscow to meet with Stalin and go over his plans to take the German capital. Unlike Hitler, Stalin did at times listen to the advice of his military commanders. He let Zhukov proceed without interference. Zhukov launched a probing attack against the German defenses and was able to overrun forward German trenches guarding the east bank. The clear day turned dark as earth and rubble blew into the sky from Russian air attacks. Destruction fell on German frontline fortifications. Before long, the German Ninth Army defenses fell apart and the Soviets were through. Since 1943, the Western Allies had continually bombed Berlin. Thousands of air bomber raids killed tens of thousands of civilians. And by April 20th, 1945, long-range Soviet artillery had begun to pound the already devastated city. Up until mid-April 1945, more than 45,000 tons of bombs had been dropped. And now Zhukov's artillery would follow this onslaught with an even greater amount of death and destruction. Battles raged in the suburbs and into the city between Soviet and German troops. On the 28th of April, Soviet soldiers entered the Ministry of the Interior building. Next, they entered the German Reichstag. By 10:50 p.m. on the night of April 30th, 1945, just before the May Day deadline set by Stalin, the hammer and sickle was raised in Berlin. Only with the hoisting of the Soviet flag at the heart of the Nazi regime did the Second World War in Europe finally end. On the 8th of May, Zhukov presided over the complete and final surrender of German armed forces. Operation Berlin was a crowning success of Zhukov's military career. Upon Zhukov's return to Moscow, Stalin believed that due to the general's success and popularity, he posed a potential threat to the Russian leader's reign. As a result, Zhukov was sent away on worthless appointments far from Moscow. With the Soviet entry into the war against Japan, it was Zhukov's armor spearheads that brought about the collapse of the Japanese army in Manchuria. When Khrushchev finally took command of the Soviet Union, Zhukov was briefly restored, serving as Deputy Minister of Defense. In this role, he formulated nuclear policy until 1957, when he was retired. He lived the rest of his life in obscurity, anxious with the regret of not having received the recognition due a great commander. Still, his death in 1974 was marked by burial with full military honors in Red Square at the Kremlin Wall. The verdict of history may judge Zhukov harshly, claiming that he bludgeoned his way to victory with virtually unlimited mass and without regard for massive casualties. Nevertheless, his application of that mass saved lives in the long run and helped shorten the war by months, if not years. In the end, the peasant soldiers and eventually the Soviet people looked upon Zhukov as nothing less than a great hero.
I am closing my 52 years of military service. When I joined the Army, even before the turn of the century, it was the fulfillment of all my boyish hopes and dreams. The world has turned over many times since I took the oath on the plain at West Point.
Indeed, Douglas MacArthur had seen the world undergo many changes. His military career spanned more than half a century, from the First World War to Vietnam. And during that career, he was often a central and dramatic figure in periods of conflict as well as periods of peace. Young Douglas grew up in a home that was rich with military influence. His father, General Arthur MacArthur, was a colonel in the Civil War, as well as a veteran of the Philippine Campaign and Spanish-American War. When MacArthur was but 13 years old, his father is said to have remarked, "I think there is the material of a soldier in that boy." His observation was to prove more than astute as the boy grew to be a man. At West Point, the young Douglas showed extraordinary brilliance in his studies. In 1899, Cadet MacArthur graduated with the highest marks ever achieved at the Academy. As Douglas was beginning his career in the Army, the campaign in the Philippines was being brought to a successful conclusion under his father's able leadership. The younger MacArthur was eager to visit the battlefields where his father had led his men to victory, so he was more than pleased when his first assignment was to survey various areas of the Philippine Islands. One in particular was the Bataan Peninsula, where many years later his intimate knowledge of the land would play a major role in a desperate and heroic struggle. As the United States entered World War I, American commanders made it clear that they intended to use only regular Army divisions against the Germans, leaving thousands of well-trained, able men in reserve divisions idle. MacArthur, now a major, recognized that not utilizing these men was a terrible waste and vigorously advocated a proposal for a new division comprised of National Guard units. Said he, "It will spread all over the country like a rainbow." Thus, the famous Rainbow Division was born. Like a protective father, MacArthur kept a watchful eye over his creation and worked constantly to see that the division was well trained and well equipped in preparation for the battles it would face in Europe. As the Rainbow Division landed in France and moved forward to the front lines, it quickly became clear that the efforts of Colonel MacArthur, now the division's chief of staff, had not been wasted. It was during this period that MacArthur began to garner notice as a battlefield tactician. He became well known for his brilliant decisions on the battlefield. As the war progressed, he was also to gain a reputation as a man fearless in the face of danger. Before long, he was in command of the Rainbow Division, the youngest American division commander in the war. Twice wounded, twice gassed, by war's end, he had been promoted to brigadier general and decorated with more awards for valor than any American soldier previously. General Blackjack Pershing described him as the greatest frontline general of the war. Returning to West Point, he continued his series of achievements by becoming the youngest man ever to serve as its superintendent. Under his leadership, the Academy's curriculum was modified to include a full college education. He also introduced a program of intramural athletics. But perhaps his most important contribution was as a role model. He was an inspiration to many of the young men who walked through West Point's doors. In 1930, MacArthur was promoted to full general temporarily so that he could serve as Army Chief of Staff. His term in office was spent revitalizing and rebuilding an army that after the war had been pared down to only 60,000 combat soldiers. It was a difficult task in which he found himself swimming against the tide of pacifism that was washing over America. In keeping with his principle of examining military situations firsthand, he toured Europe to observe the forces of other nations. During his travels, He was once more recognized for his outstanding military contribution to the Allied cause, this time by the French. While his stay in France was gratifying, what he discovered while visiting Germany deeply alarmed him. He clearly saw a country preparing for war. Back home, MacArthur beseeched the country and the Congress to realize that the rise of Hitler and the Nazis posed a serious threat to the United States. Recognizing his abilities, President Roosevelt broke precedent by appointing him to a second term as Chief of Staff. Following the second term, he was asked to return to the Philippines, this time as a military advisor. It was during this period that a deep mutual respect developed between the Filipino people and MacArthur. In 1935, he began a 10-year plan to build up the defenses of the Philippines, recruiting and training troops that he would later lead into battle. In 1936, President Quezon of the Philippines made him a field marshal in the Philippine Army. In 1937, having served for 34 years, Douglas MacArthur retired from the United States Army at the age of 57. But 4 short years later, it was as though his military career was beginning all over again. In 1941, with tensions rising between America and Japan, President Roosevelt recalled MacArthur to active service as a lieutenant general. 2 months later, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and within days, the Philippine Islands. MacArthur's defensive efforts were severely hampered by lack of men and aircraft. Drawing on his understanding of past campaigns, particularly those of his father, and his personal knowledge of the area, MacArthur withdrew his meager forces into the mountains of the Bataan Peninsula. From the rocky fortress of Corregidor, he directed an operation as crucial as any in the war. 6 months of desperate fighting by a lonely army of Filipinos and Americans caused a critical delay in the Japanese timetable. As leader of the first American ground battle, MacArthur became a heroic symbol to a nation just beginning to prepare itself emotionally for all-out war. The people found in him what they were beginning to discover in themselves, a spirit of intense pride and determination. However determined he may have been, when it became clear that the Philippine cause was lost, President Roosevelt, who regarded MacArthur as our greatest general, ordered him to Australia. Leaving the Philippines hurt him deeply. As always, MacArthur wished to be with his men, and perhaps even worse, he felt as if he had abandoned the people of the islands. Upon arriving in Australia, he spoke to reporters, but more specifically to the soldiers and citizens he had left behind, telling them in no uncertain terms, "I shall return." MacArthur found the Australian and American commanders in a near panic. Their plan was to shore up their defenses and wait for a Japanese attack. It soon became apparent that the new Southwest Pacific commander had another agenda. Determined to live up to his promise, he shifted his troops to New Guinea, the first step on a direct route back to the Philippines. However direct the route, the journey would be long and difficult. Countless islands occupied with hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers stood in the way. The plan of attack recommended by MacArthur's fellow commanders was to move step by step, blasting the enemy from every one of his island positions in the Pacific. The commander, knowing the area, knowing the enemy, and utilizing all of the air and naval resources available, devised a new plan. to capture only those islands necessary to cut Japanese supply lines and stage the next assault on the way to the Philippines. Losses on the Allied side were relatively small since damaging frontal assaults were avoided. Thousands of Japanese prepared to fight to the death were never given the opportunity. Although many were captured, thousands more were isolated, their supply and communication lines cut off. In MacArthur's words, the main body of the enemy was left to wither on the vine. To the outside world, informed by newsreels, the progress being made by the general was admired and applauded. But those who understood MacArthur knew that underlying every decision, shaping every move, was his determination to return to the Philippines. Invasions in the Southwest Pacific continued. To the commander, these hard-fought steps zigzagging along the coast of New Guinea were necessary. Finally, early in 1944, having gained the northwestern end of the island, with thousands of the enemy bypassed, there was no question in his mind what the next objective was. However, President Roosevelt wasn't so sure. Heated discussions between MacArthur, Admiral Nimitz, and the president took place about their next move. Should it be Formosa or the Philippines? MacArthur emphatically argued that based on moral grounds, they must return to support their allies and friends, the Filipinos. Nimitz argued that the decision ought to be based on military rather than moral imperatives. Roosevelt, always a man of the people, sided with MacArthur. "41 years before, as a newly commissioned lieutenant, MacArthur had visited and surveyed the Philippine Islands. Now, 2 miles off the starboard, his men were going ashore on the island of Leyte. Once again, the enemy was unprepared for the attack. Soon, a seemingly endless flow of LSTs were filling the beaches with men and equipment, the result of a carefully laid and well-executed plan. Directing the attack, MacArthur seemed to be everywhere at once. Every day, at some point, men near the front would spot the familiar faded field marshal's cap and corncob pipe. The landings at Leyte and Lingayen Gulf were only the first part of the battle. Now they faced the final and most difficult leg of their journey, the drive to Manila. Once the Americans reached the city, it became clear that the enemy had dug in for a long siege. Block by block, the fighting raged on. To MacArthur, this was the return. This was the climax of the mission to which he was so deeply dedicated. Finally, while civilians celebrated joyfully at one end of the city and the enemy still fought bitterly at the other, MacArthur entered Manila. He had kept his promise. "I'm a little late," MacArthur said, "but we finally came." Once more, Corregidor and the Philippines were under the protection of an American flag. As the principal architect of the Pacific victory, considered by many to be the greatest general of the war, MacArthur was the natural choice as supreme commander to oversee the surrender of Japan. Aboard the battleship Missouri, a solemn, awe-inspiring ceremony took place. At its conclusion, General Douglas MacArthur gave a speech which reflected the spirit of this great soldier, his understanding of war and peace, and the historic moment over which he was presiding.
It is my earnest hope, and indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion, a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past. A world founded upon faith and understanding. A world dedicated to the dignity of man and the fulfillment of his most cherished wish for freedom, tolerance, and justice. Let us pray that peace be now restored to the world, and that God will preserve it always. These proceedings are closed.
Now began one of the strangest occupations of any land by any conqueror. An idealist with firm convictions on the way democracy should be presented to Eastern people, MacArthur was determined to guide the Japanese through a complete social revolution. While the emperor's deep hold upon the people was retained, almost every other institution became affected by Western democracy, an entirely new concept to the Japanese. In Japan, the social reforms urged by MacArthur proved one of the most successful experiments in history. Then suddenly, just as he was completing his mission in Japan, MacArthur found himself once again being drawn into battle. A huge North Korean military force swept down across the 38th parallel. Americans serving as occupation troops in Japan were flown into South Korea in a rapid show of strength. MacArthur deployed his meager force in a way that he hoped would make it appear larger than it actually was. The strategy worked. When the North Koreans ran into resistance, they held up their advance, waiting for additional men and artillery while U.S. troops poured into South Korea. MacArthur's ruse had prevented a rout. During the ensuing months, General MacArthur guided the war as Commander-in-Chief of United Nations forces in Korea. Even though he was in his 70s, MacArthur, wishing to study the fighting at close range, paid regular visits to the battlefields, dauntless as always. Then came the daring amphibious attack at Incheon. Behind enemy lines, on shores that others had declared too dangerous for landing, the attack was a complete surprise and a complete success. The North Korean army was demoralized and the victory was recognized as a masterpiece of strategy. The Korean War continued northward with orders for the destruction of the North Korean armed forces. Suddenly, the Chinese entered the conflict, raising new questions, not only military, but political as well. While carrying out what he considered to be his duty as Supreme Commander, the pursuit of victory on the battlefield, General MacArthur came into conflict with those he served. His long and distinguished military career was suddenly brought to a close by an official order from the President, Commander-in-Chief of U.S. military forces. For the first time in 14 years, he was homeward bound. The San Francisco reception was the largest, most illustrious the city had ever known. The hero was home from the wars at last, and then General MacArthur stepped down from the great panorama of history in which he had figured so brilliantly with a soldier's words spoken from a soldier's heart.
The world has turned over many times since I took the oath on the plain at West Point, and the hopes and dreams have long since vanished. But I still remember the refrain of one of the most popular barrack ballads of that day, which proclaimed most proudly that old soldiers never die. They just fade away. And like the old soldier of that battle, I now close my military career and just fade away. An old soldier who tried to do his duty as God gave him the light to see that duty. Goodbye.
A brilliant tactician and a man of his word, MacArthur dedicated his life to his country as one of the longest-serving generals in the United States Army. A remarkable man, a remarkable life. Douglas MacArthur, a hero. The early life of George Catlett Marshall, the boy who would grow up to help lead his country to victory in 2 wars, held no clues as to the great path which life had laid out before him. Born in 1880 in the small, slow-moving community of Uniontown, Pennsylvania, young Marshall had no direct experience with the Army in which he would one day serve. His only contact with the military came secondhand, through his father's recollections of the Civil War. America's Indian frontier had only recently been conquered, and the stories of Custer and Carson were still fresh enough to excite the imagination of any boy. Looking back, it's hard to find the precise reason why young George Marshall decided to make the Army his profession, but choose it he did, and began his career at a soldier's school. The Virginia Military Institute had trained many distinguished Army men before George Marshall arrived in September of 1897. VMI provided an environment calculated to encourage a young man with Army ambitions, and Marshall, in his 4 years at the school, rose to the rank of cadet first captain. A young man with a passion for facts and an ability to apply them imaginatively, he was an honored graduate with a reputation for military skill and knowledge, which was to follow him throughout his Army career. Shortly after being commissioned an infantry second lieutenant in 1901, Marshall found himself on troop duty in the Philippines. Assignments in the Oklahoma Territory, Texas, Massachusetts, and the Fort Leavenworth Staff College filled the early years of his career. By the time the United States began to mobilize for the Great War in 1916, George Marshall had become a captain. He landed in France with the 1st American troops, and as a member of the 1st Division staff, he helped plan the Battle of Cantigny. As chief of operations prior to the Meuse-Argonne offensive, Marshall planned the successful movement of almost 1 million troops, which made the great Allied breakthrough possible. Marshall had helped engineer the final victory. Marshall had risen to full colonel, and his enormous contributions to staff planning were being widely recognized. His work brought Pershing's personal commendation. His reputation for brilliance distinguished him from his colleagues. As a result, Marshall emerged from World War I as one of the most promising young officers in the Army. Assigned as aide to General Pershing, Marshall's work kept him in close contact with the Allied Expeditionary Force commander during the last days in Europe. Little did Signal Corps photographers realize that the lean young colonel at his side would someday be as newsworthy a figure as the illustrious Black Jack Pershing. Late in the summer of 1919, General Pershing bade farewell to France and boarded the Leviathan for America. With him went Colonel George Marshall, proud of the reputation he had acquired as a military planner, disappointed in the fact that he had been considered too valuable to spare for the combat command he coveted. Pershing had recommended Marshall's promotion to brigadier, but the war's end prevented it. The two things most important to a professional soldier's career, command and promotion, had been denied Marshall, either through unfortunate timing or because the talents he possessed were considered too precious to squander on the battlefield. Marshall's return was a time of triumph and frustration. He had learned the business of war in a tough school and knew it as few others did, but he could take little pleasure in the knowledge. Long after the noise and shouting of this joyous harbor scene passed into memory and the world once again took up arms, Marshall was ready. But as the Leviathan docked in New York, he was still an obscure staff officer with a cinder in his eye. As Pershing's aide, Marshall was expected to keep the same grueling schedule of official appearances that his boss did. These were the years when policies affecting the future security of the nation were being decided. The post-war role of the Army was debated by both military and political leaders. Pershing believed in a well-trained professional force backed by a large citizen army, and in Marshall he found an enthusiastic supporter. It was this kind of army which had brought peace to Europe in 1918. As a member of Pershing's staff, Marshall devoted much of his time and effort to achieving the citizen army goal. 1924 brought his next assignment, duty with the 15th Infantry Regiment in Tientsin, China. Here, with the commanding officer of the 15th, Marshall posed for a rare picture in mufti. It was his first actual troop assignment in nearly 10 years. In the mid-20s, China was fragmented by civil war and revolution, and the private armies of Chinese warlords fought in all parts of the land for national advantage. The mission of the 15th Infantry was to help protect both American trading concessions and American lives. It was a tense but quiet assignment for Marshall, and before he finished his tour, the 15th had acquired a reputation for smart appearance and snappy precision. It could outperform and outshine every other garrison regiment in Tientsin. From 1927 to 1931, the distinguished faculty at the Fort Benning Infantry School, which included future Generals Bradley, Stilwell, and Collins, operated under Marshall's direction. When he took over the school, he found much of the instruction had fallen behind the times, and Marshall was not satisfied to refight old wars. It was the present and the future with which he was concerned, and he revised the curriculum accordingly. In the 1930s, the world caught fire, ignited by a handful of global arsonists. Germany, driven by economic ruin and the visions of a madman, was threatening to even the score for her defeat in 1918. On the other side of the world, Japan was attempting to crush its Asian neighbors. The Japanese onslaught against China carried out the ambitions and aspirations of a nation bent on territorial conquest. For a while, many laughed at the pompous, preening caricature speaking from a Roman balcony, but his intended victims in Ethiopia did not laugh. They were a proud and fierce people, determined to resist the Italian dictator's aggression. Haile Selassie, Ethiopia's leader, made an appeal to the world, but no one came forward to answer it. When it was over, Benito Mussolini had demonstrated for his friends how easy conquest could be. The day Germany invaded Poland, George Marshall, then a brigadier general, made the extraordinary jump from 1 to 4 stars and became the Army's chief of staff. For Secretary of War Stimson, the task of mobilization lay ahead, and the resources of a mighty nation had to be tapped to produce the tools needed to restore peace to the world. Marshall had waited in the wings for 20 years for the role he was about to play. The great citizen army in which Marshall believed so deeply had to be activated, trained, and equipped to fight. With each passing month in 1940 and 41, it appeared increasingly probable that the United States would be drawn into the war. The Army, which numbered less than 200,000 men when Marshall took over as Chief of Staff, would eventually swell to more than 8 million before the Axis defeat. His accumulated experience, the early days in the Philippines, Cantigny and the Mozart gun offensive, staff work with Pershing, China, Fort Benning, and the National Guard, the sum total was imaginatively applied by George Marshall in directing the United States Army during the war. It was as if every moment was in some way intended to prepare him for the monumental task he undertook. The American military buildup was just beginning to gain momentum when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. At an inspection of the Army's new airborne troops at Fort Bragg in 1942, Marshall took an up-close look at the citizen soldier at work. Field soldiers never knew when the Chief of Staff might make an appearance such as this one at the Jungle Warfare Center in Hawaii. Marshall might have done his thinking and planning in Washington, but it was from the field that he drew his facts. A gifted observer, he had an eye for detail. Jungle training was a new experience for American troops, but it was clear to Marshall from the beginning that in order to win the war in the Pacific, our soldiers had to beat the Japanese at their own game. In the forbidding gray of a November dawn in 1942, American naval vessels moved toward the beaches of North Africa to deliver the first major Allied counterattack since the outbreak of the war. Their objective? The German Afrika Korps in Tunisia. The enemy was led by Germany's ingenious Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox. Desperately, the Germans fought to keep from being pushed into the sea. By the time Allied military advisors convened in Casablanca in January 1943, the North Africa campaign had become tough and bitter, but the achievement of a unified Allied command was part of the ultimate victory. Marshall had worked tirelessly to achieve a smooth-running command organization at the highest American level. He held the President's trust and regard and was consulted on every decision affecting the conduct of the war. Marshall's natural diplomatic skill helped reconcile the many conflicts with British leaders at Casablanca. From the North African meetings came the Allied decision to bomb Germany around the clock, as well as the decision to invade Sicily. In July of 1943, Americans and British jumped off from Africa on the preliminary leg of the assault on Hitler's fortress Europe, Italy. By the time Allied leaders convened at Cairo in December 1943, the Italian campaign was well underway, and the war against the Japanese demanded that operations be stepped up. The future of the China, Burma, India theater and the problem of harnessing China's manpower had to be resolved. At Tehran, Marshall took part in planning a joint strategy with the Russians. When Soviet demands for an expanded Second Front were addressed to the United States, it was George Marshall who answered. When the Chief of Staff visited the Pacific Theater on his return from Tehran, our offensive was gaining speed. Island by island, we were moving in on Japan. Marshall listened to a first-hand report on the successful operations in the Gilbert Islands and the planned invasion of the Marshalls. He discussed with General Douglas MacArthur, Pacific Theater commander, the Allied push that would carry them to the very doorstep of Japan. Italy had become a slow and painful struggle. The road to Rome was a long one, and for Marshall and his wife, one of extreme personal anxiety. Marshall's stepson, a tank commander under Patton, had been engaged in the very heaviest fighting for weeks. When the Americans finally broke through the lines of a stubborn enemy, the young officer had fought his last fight. For George Marshall, the war had turned into a personal tragedy. The spring of 1944 brought the long-planned invasion of France. Marshall accompanied General Eisenhower and other high-ranking officers ashore for an inspection of the American positions on the Normandy beachhead. 15 stars filled this corporal's jeep as Admiral King and Generals Marshall, Bradley, and Eisenhower rode out to survey the battle damage. On this trip, Marshall took a few moments to visit an old friend, Patton, the colorful ex-cavalry man whose fast-moving armored columns had many times torn great holes in the German defenses. Marshall considered Patton one of the ablest field commanders in the Army, and the Chief of Staff had personally ordered the mercurial general to his original combat assignment in North Africa. The subsequent performance of the troops under Patton's command confirmed General Marshall's wise choice. Allied planners met again in 1944, this time at Quebec. A decision was reached to invade the Philippines 3 months ahead of schedule. Marshall returned from Quebec to fly immediately to Paris with Secretary of State James Burns for another meeting with General Eisenhower. The Chief of Staff was involved with the vast and complicated problem of global supply lines, and he chose to inspect the divisions poised for the final thrust into Germany. A minor slack in the line of supply at this moment could cause a major military disaster, and Marshall knew the price of failure was far too high to risk delay. The trip to Europe provided Marshall with another opportunity, a chance to talk with the troops. He spoke informally to American soldiers who had faced the toughest test in history and triumph. Marshall inspected their positions within range of the enemy, his last close look before the Axis collapse. World War II ended with the final capitulation of Japan. When President Truman presented Marshall with the Distinguished Service Medal in 1945, he said that although millions gave America extraordinary service, Marshall gave it victory. 1945 also saw Marshall dispatched to China as the president's special representative to negotiate a truce between Chiang Kai-shek and the communists. General Eisenhower, then Chief of Staff, visited his former boss during negotiations. This was the first time Marshall had officially functioned as a diplomat, a role he played throughout the war, resolving bitter disputes within the Allied camp. Diplomacy suited Marshall's honest, frank temperament, and in 1947 he took the oath of office as Secretary of State. The President enthusiastically endorsed the former Chief of Staff at a critical time in history. It was fairly said that Mr. Truman selected him not because of his diplomatic experience, but because he was Marshall.
There's nothing that I can say at this time regarding matters that pertain to my position in the State Department. But I assume the duties with a feeling of great responsibility and a very earnest desire to carry out the foreign policy of this government in the manner that has been so splendidly exemplified by my predecessor, Mr. Burns, my old friend.
The new secretary brought imagination and a dignified intensity to his job, which was equal to the world challenge. In March 1947, Marshall headed a delegation to Moscow. His mission was to forge an agreement on the future of Germany and Austria. And the opportunity to observe the Russian bear in his native environment was valuable in view of the increasing Soviet hostility. Russia already loomed as the largest question mark in America's future. The desperate economic plight of Europe drew Marshall's attention, and upon his return, his recommendations were presented to the Congress. The great rubble heaps left by the war were soon diminished by an American investment in international friendship and goodwill, the Marshall Plan. which also proved an effective economic weapon against spreading communism. Offered on a self-help basis, the plan enabled many war-ravaged countries to regain their first foothold on a stable peacetime economy. Trade and production were stimulated, and communist strategies that were dependent on poverty and despair for their success were thwarted in many parts of the world. George Marshall resigned as Secretary of State in January 1949, intending to relax for the first time in almost 50 years. But the National Red Cross called upon him for one further task in the public interest when it asked him to serve as its head. Less than 1 year later, the President persuaded him to return to the government as Secretary of Defense. He flew to Korea, where he met with General Ridgway and other UN leaders. This was a different kind of army and a different kind of war than Marshall had known. The citizen soldiers still did the fighting in Korea, but this time under a UN banner and for a limited objective. In Washington, Marshall assumed the critical responsibility for all of the men and materiel necessary for victory in Korea. The peculiar circumstances of the conflict called for the existence of large American forces without total mobilization in the United States. Once more, George Marshall, the statesman, distinguished himself. On the 50th anniversary of his graduation, the Virginia Military Institute paid tribute to General Marshall with a day named in his honor. Many of his old classmates came to Lexington to applaud the school's most distinguished graduate and to recall their years as members of the Cadet Corps. After a howitzer salute to the soldier statesman, the entire body of cadets stood at attention while Marshall was awarded Virginia's Distinguished Service Medal by Governor John Battle. Then the man whose life represents the highest ideals of the Cadet Corps inspected the ranks of young men following in his footsteps. George Catlett Marshall resigned from the Defense Department and settled in Leesburg, Virginia. Recognition of his contributions to the world at large came his way in 1953 when he received the Nobel Peace Prize. 6 years later, at the age of 79, George Marshall passed away, bringing to a close one of the most illustrious public service careers and honorable lives in American history. A remarkable life, a remarkable man, George Catlett Marshall, a hero.